Good evening once again and welcome back. You can join our discussion either on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, on our website, or any of our other platforms. And you see the details of those platforms scrolling on your television screen as we speak. But now we'll get into the main conversation. Welcome and thank you very much for joining me on the show this evening.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
We've had a lot of horror stories coming out of Libya this year, especially the most recent reports by CNN indicating that there were actually slave auctions that were taking place. But I know that when CNN did their report in November, as a matter of fact, your organization, the International Organization for Migration, had been raising the alarm as far back as April this year, that there were unusual things that you were noticing as far as those trying to get across the Sahara were concerned. And you brought the world's attention to it, but I suppose sometimes when it's on television, it's more vivid than when it comes out as a warning in a report. Over the years, I don't think that there has been any lack of information on the hazards of doing the trip across the Sahara to try and get into Europe. We've seen the difficulties of people crossing the Sahara. We've seen people crossing the Mediterranean Sea in those rickety vessels and drowning in the process. Why do you think, from your work, especially with those who are returning migrants, that people see the risk but decide not to pay any attention to it?
I think it's a mix of a lot of different reasons that create that situation where we feel that by now there has been a lot of information about the dangers of engaging into irregular migration, but at the same time, even as we speak today, we have young people starting the journey from various West African countries, including Ghana. And I think the reason that is happening is because these young people, they have that desire for a better life. They are very drawn by what they see as a much better life in Europe. And regardless of the risk that some of them know, I think it's very easy to distance yourself from what you can hear, especially if you hear it from a source that seems to be official source, a source that you don't find credible. And a lot of young people think that they will make it. You hear a lot of them saying, yeah, I know that some people have died, but some people have made it. I know so-and-so who managed to get there. So for me, it will be a successful experience. And if it doesn't work, it's a risk that I'm willing to take. So I think for us, it's very important to make sure that the information can reach those young people where they are, packaged in the way that they can absorb it and resonate with them. And this is also the reason why we have appointed Kofi Kinata, who is a very famous Ghanaian singer, but who is also young and very close to that group that we want to engage with, to carry the message across, to say that yes, this is a serious situation that we are talking about. The level of human rights abuses that we are talking about have reached unprecedented levels, and that the risk is very high for them, even if they do not die, to endure situations that none of us would want to be exposed to.
So when your report came out in April, what actually were the things that the organization noticed that it wanted to draw attention to?
So what happened in April, because we have people on the ground along the corridor, and some of the returning migrants from Libya, especially when they're arriving in our transit center in Niger, we're talking about migrants being sold and bought, in addition to the regular kidnappings that have been a regular occurrence, unfortunately, for many, many years. So that has led us to try and corroborate those stories that we were hearing. And it was very clear that there was indeed, in addition to the smuggling and to the trafficking, there was now this new phenomenon of selling migrants for money.
There's a common perception that it is people who are very disadvantaged and very poor who make the efforts to migrate across the Sahara, across the northern African countries into Europe. But the fact of the matter is that that journey is actually quite expensive, because they have to pay the people who are taking them to be able to get across. From your experience working with both returning migrants and sometimes cautioning those who are trying to find their way there, what has been the typical makeup of those young people who are trying to get across the Sahara? Do they fit the stereotype that these are really some of the poorest people, or is it the case that they do have something to do, but they think that the opportunity there is much better?
I think it's a little bit of all of that. First of all, very often the poorest do not migrate, because you need access to some level of resources, you need some networks, and you need some connections to migrate. So it is never the poorest who migrate. At the same time, you do not necessarily need a huge amount of money to start the journey, and some young people start the journey with very little in their pockets. It is quite easy at the moment to reach Niger with a bus. Several towns in Ghana have direct connections to Agadez. So the journey doesn't require a big capital to start. But some also sell what they have, the little shop, the house, and they think that it's a good investment to make, because they believe that migration will give them more money to take care of themselves and their families. So it's a risk that they are willing to take, and it's an investment that they are willing to take. Some migrants, as I was saying, who start the journey with very little, will also work along the way to save money for the next step. And in the past, when Libya was more stable and was a desirable destination in itself, migrants would work there sometimes for years, and sometimes not even trying to cross, or would work until they have saved enough that they can pay the fee for passage. So you have a mixed bag of scenarios when it comes to the financial resources that are necessary for the trip, but it definitely costs a lot of money, especially these days.
But Libya is not the only route that migrants take to cross and to get into Europe, isn't it? They also go through other northern African countries. Typically, which are the countries that are most accessible, if you like, for prospective migrants?
So we have three main routes when we're talking about irregular migration crossing into Europe. We have three main routes that we talk about. There's the western one, which is mainly Morocco and Algeria crossing into Spain. We have the eastern one, which is from Turkey into Greece. And we have the central Mediterranean one, which is the one that we are talking a lot these days, which is mainly from Libya into Italy. And the central Mediterranean one is really where the bulk of the movements are taking place at the moment. 70% of the arrivals this year have been to Italy. The other 30% are spread across Spain, Cyprus, and Greece. So when we're really talking about the eye of the storm at the moment is really the central Mediterranean route. And what makes it worse is that this is also the most dangerous one. This is the one where the criminal networks are extremely active, where the human smugglers and the human traffickers are preying on the vulnerability of the migrants to make money, basically. So this year we had around 180,000, I would say more or less, arrivals in Italy, 170,000 globally, and a lot of it is through the central Mediterranean route.
So typically, what is the country breakdown in percentage terms of those who are trying to get through the central Mediterranean route?
So the whole of West Africa, unfortunately, is engaged in those movements. But we have some key countries, first one being Nigeria, but we also have the Gambia, Senegal, Mali, new countries like Cote d'Ivoire and Guinea, sending a lot of people recently, and Ghana also being one of them.
The perception that we have, and of course based on previous experience, is that a lot of the persons who are attempting to make this journey out of Ghana are from the Brong-Ahafo region. Is that indeed still the case today? And given the fact that there is quite a significant amount of agricultural activity that takes place in the Brong-Ahafo region, what do you think is the main incentive for people from that area trying to use this very hazardous route to get across into Europe?
Mm-hmm. So the Brong-Ahafo region, you're very correct, was one of the main hubs for irregular migration out of Ghana, and traditionally a lot of young people have left from there. But what we are seeing, and when we are looking at where the recent migrants that we have returned just last week, where they are going back to, we see that there is now a little bit more diverse destinations. We are seeing an increase of returns to the Western region and to the Ashanti region. So Takoradi and Kumasi are now areas of return, which also means that they are areas of departure.
So when you have the migrants coming back, when they find their way back into Ghana again and you help them to return, how do you help them to adjust to that process of returning into country? Because they left for greener pastures. They weren't able to achieve the greener pastures. They must be psychologically very depressed in some instances. And of course, there still is the pressure to be able to earn a living. So how does the International Organization for Migration help them in this process?
So the process of protection that we see as a very holistic approach that needs to start from Libya up to the country of origin. We integrate a human rights approach. We have a psychosocial approach to that. Now we are dealing with migrants that are coming back from detention centers, which was not the case in the past. So we are overwhelmingly dealing with a population that has suffered some level of trauma. A lot of them are coming, they are malnourished because they do not receive enough food in the detention centers, whether they're official ones or unofficial ones. And the official ones are now being crowded because some of the unofficial ones have been closed down and the migrants transferred into official detention centers. So there's a problem of overcrowding. There's a problem of sanitation facilities that are not adequate. There's a problem of ventilation that is not adequate. Recreation definitely is not happening for many of these migrants. So they come and they're already very weak. Some of them are sick. They're malnourished, as I said before. Some of them have went through experiences that have left an impact on them. At the airport last week when they were returning, it was quite heartbreaking to see so many of them saying, Ghana is the best place. I regret going. I don't understand why I didn't even started that whole journey. I'm so happy to be back home. So there is this overwhelmingly how can I say, happiness to be back. And they suffered through a lot. And it's really now our responsibility to make sure that we give them a new chance and a proper chance. So that starts with proper reception. And at the airport, when we receive them, we give them food. We give them cash on arrival to make sure that they can continue the journey home if they are not from Greater Accra region. So we also transported them to the main coach stations in Accra to facilitate their onward transportation. So they have that little money to cover their basic needs on arrival. Then they're given the information about how to contact IOM and what is going to happen next. We prioritize the most vulnerable ones, the women, the sick, the elderly, the children. Last time we had children, 3 children on the plane. We had one woman, we had an old man of 68 years. And we had a few who were sick. One had to be hospitalized immediately. Another one, it was so sad to see because at some point he was calling me, and when I went close to him, he said, I'm not feeling well. And I said, what do you have? He said, I have a problem with my eye. And then I look at his eye, and I actually see that the eye is no longer clear. he was losing the eyesight, but it has started in the detention center and he couldn't get the medical treatment for that. And I think he has lost or is very close to losing his eyesight in that eye. So really the priority now is to take care of all these cases that are urgent, and then to work on the reintegration. And that's going to be a very big challenge because we're receiving big numbers. As much as we have experience doing returns, and in 2011 we returned 19,000 Ghanaians out of Libya. But I think the challenge this time around is going to be with the reintegration. How do we make sure that there's livelihood available for these young people and returnees that we have brought back?
Which means that there has to be a lot more collaboration with multiplicity of agencies and civil society organizations and just persons of goodwill to try and make this happen. We'll take a short commercial break and then we'll be back to continue our program. Stay with us. I think this is an interesting conversation.